John Adams and the Jews. In an amazing letter, John Adams wrote to a correspondent named Francois Adrien Vanderkamp. He writes this in 1809. Adams writes the following: "If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate has ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of the other sect who believed or pretended to believe that all is ordained by chance, I should believe that chance has ordered the Jews to preserve and to propagate to all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the greatest essential principle of all morality and consequently all of civilization. I can't say now, okay, that's amazing. What great praise of the Jews. He's got to throw something in. Come on, this is the right. He is a WASP after all. I can't say that I love Jews very much neither, nor the French, nor the English, nor the Romans, nor the Greeks. But okay, he tempers that. We must love all nations as well as we can, but it is very hard to love most of them. All right, that's fine. That's whatever. John Adams is one of my favorite. He's a remarkable person. And Benjamin Franklin, who got to know Adams very well, they did not get along, or at least Adams, they didn't get along. They did not get along. Franklin said of Adams, "I am persuaded that he means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes and in some things, absolutely out of his senses." That was Franklin. That was Franklin's assessment of Adams. John Adams was brilliant, passionate. He was tender. He was firm. He was caring. He was deeply loyal, fanatically patriotic, fascinating, yet he's deeply flawed. He's often historically overlooked. And he is, and why I find him to be an endearing subject to study, he's extremely human. He's a deeply human historical figure. And that's why I find him to be a fascinating person to study. He's largely overlooked historically, I think because he was a flawed person, because he was a very human person, and because most of his great and amazing, really life-changing, world-changing impacts were mainly done before his presidency. His presidency was pretty mediocre. He's a very average president. If you rate his presidency, very middle of the pack. And because of that, I think he's been a little bit historically forgotten. When we think of the great founding fathers, we think of Washington, we think of Jefferson, we think of Franklin, maybe we think of Hamilton, and then like maybe even Madison, and then we get to people like Adams, when the truth of the matter is Adams was certainly incredibly significant in terms of the founding of this country. And remarkably, his interactions with the Jewish community did exist, minor, but they're fascinating and they are intriguing. And tonight, we're going to explore this interesting person. What were his connections with the Jewish community? How did he impact the Jewish community? What were some of his struggles? What were some of his insights? And what were some of his accomplishments? Let me go to my slide over here. Let's go back up to take it from the top. John Adams was born in 1730 something. I don't have it over here. 1730 something over here. I don't know why I didn't write it down. He was a descendant of Puritans. He was a classic. He would call himself John Yankee. He was a classic descendant of the hardcore, deeply intolerantly religious Puritans who came over, in the 1600s. He was I think the first Adam was his great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather, and he was a direct descendant of those extreme, severe, and intolerant Puritans. He had his parents were, classic New England Puritans. He went to, as a child, very early on, his parents saw that he was very smart. His dad, Adams, didn't want to go to school. He wanted to just be a farmer, and his dad saw that he was very smart, and they negotiated. He made his way to Harvard, classic Boston type of person, and he was brilliant. It was very apparent very early on that John Adams was brilliant. He wasn't just smart, but he was incredibly well-read, very well-read. That's the house that he was born in. He was born in Braintree, Massachusetts, which is now Quincy, Massachusetts, which is now really a suburb of Boston. From what I understand, it's a pretty bad neighborhood. I've never been there, but my understanding. But back then, it was a separate city called Braintree, right on the coast. He was about 2 miles from the sea, and he very much connected to the sea, as we'll see. Pardon the pun. And that's where he was from. Now it's really just part of metropolitan Boston. But back then it was kind of like a suburb or a distant town, one town over from Boston. He kept, and why Adams is one of the most fascinating people to actually study, is he kept an incredibly detailed and voluminous diary. He had a diary from the youngest of ages, something that he passed on, a trait that he passed on to his son, John Quincy Adams, of whom in just a moment. So we know so much detail about Adams because he wrote so much down, but they weren't just boring details like Thomas Jefferson would write down the barometric pressure and the weather. He was colorful, fascinating, intriguing, vulnerable. He would write his most deepest thoughts. And I mean, it's just remarkable. That's why he's a fascinating person to study. Aside from his own personal diaries, we'll see moving forward, he was a tremendous letter writer. He had tremendous correspondences with amazing people, including the person we started this class with, this fellow Francois Adrien Vanderkamp, just some random guy we just came pen pal with. He was like some kind of diplomat, I think, from Sweden. So we know a lot about Adams, way more, significantly more than almost any of the other founding fathers, from his diaries and his correspondences, which survive till today. Adams is a young man. His greatest asset throughout his life, without a question, John Adams' greatest asset was Abigail. His wife, Abigail Smith Adams, was a remarkable person in her own right, is probably the most studied first lady in American history, or certainly in the top tier. She really, really was a remarkable person. They had a phenomenal marriage. How do we know that? Because their letters survive, and they are actually really sweet and tender. They're really beautiful. The letters that they wrote to one another, they really had a very, very loving, caring relationship. And as we'll see in a moment, they spent a lot of time apart during Adams' work during the Revolutionary War period. He was gone for many, many, many years. But they had a very, very deep relationship. From everything that we know, he was faithful during that separation. He deeply respected her as well as her opinions. She was very influential in John Adams' life, not just his personal life. They really were a team. John Adams very rarely made decisions without Abigail Adams' input. Probably one of the most charming letters that Abigail Adams ever wrote, one of the most charming letters ever written. Abigail's is during, I think this is in March 1776, just a few months before the Declaration is written. Adams is out he's down in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress. And she writes this whole letter about how difficult it was. Boston is still under siege. And she says, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, these are the most enshrined words in Abigail Adams' life. I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to ferment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Women, we're going to rebel. So Adams writes back, listen to this. He says, depend on it. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fall and softly and practice. You know, we are all in it. And listen to this. And in practice, we all know we are all the subjects. We have only the name of masters. And rather than give this up, which we would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes, I think he says, oh, I cut it off. I think he's like, would fight against such a rebellion. It's a very cute little thing. Like, yeah, right, we're gonna put down your rebellion with all the women. But it's interesting when he writes that we're the masters in name. In reality, we're the subjects. That wasn't cute. That actually was their relationship. He really, really felt a real companionship with Abigail. They would end up having 6 children together, but they had a very, very unfortunate situation with their kids. They had 2 of their boys, Charles and Thomas, would end up dying of alcoholism. Charles broke John Adams' heart, really broke his heart. He became just a total, drunkard and Adams, he wrote him off. He kind of kicked him out of his family. Abigail did not. Interesting, but John did. They had 2 daughters, Susanna and Elizabeth, who died in infancy. Their oldest daughter was named Abigail, also, but they called her Nabby. She married a fellow named Colonel Charles Smith, who also ended up pretty much being a deadbeat dad, and left Nabby basically a widow with a live husband. It was very, very tragic. She ended up dying of breast cancer in 1811 with John Adams and Abigail there. It was very, very difficult for them. Of course, their one famous son that everyone does know. Oh, that's Abigail. That's the last portrait. I believe that's the last portrait we have of her. Of course, their pride and joy would be their oldest son, John Quincy Adams. That he's the first president to be photographed. If you want to, I think that's the first president who's ever been photographed. That would be their son, John Quincy, who, as I mentioned, continued the practice of carrying a diary. And again, fascinating diary, and a fascinating person in his own right. We should do a class on John Quincy Adams, one of the most overlooked president. Probably most historians will tell you the smartest person to ever live in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy. Well, we'll get there. John Quincy Adams had the most, in my opinion, probably the most remarkable resume out of anyone in the history of the United States of America. Yet he's largely forgotten. Can we hold, just in the interest of time, do you mind if we hold questions to the end? Does that work? Okay, terrific. Now we talk about Adams and the Jews. Well, we have to, once we're talking about his kids, we may as well talk about, it would be John Quincy Adams' grandson, would be a famous historian named Henry Adams. So this would be John Adams' great-grandson. Let's listen to something that, now he wrote a lot of historical works, particularly of the periods of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And here are one of many quotes that Henry Adams would write, very similar, but here's one of them. I detest the Jews and everything connected with them, and I live only and solely with the hope of seeing their demise, with all their accursed Judaism. I want to see all the lenders and interest taken out and executed. Henry Adams was a virulent anti-Semite and a horrible person all around. Let's talk about the Jewish community during this time. During the colonial period, we've had several classes just on the colonial period and the Revolutionary War period. But just as a reminder, a quick snapshot of what the Jews of the Revolutionary of this period. So let's talk about the late 1700s, early 1800s. Up to, let's say, 1820, which is like a new wave of Jews. You have roughly, it's hard to know the demographics, roughly 2,500 Jews, and that's the number that they throw around. Roughly 2,500 Jews at the eve of the Revolutionary War. So it's small, it's very small. But they were, we don't want to overstate it, they were influential, but not overly influential. Jews lived mainly in 5 cities: New York, Charleston, which had the biggest Jewish community, Savannah, Philadelphia. A new up-and-coming city was Lancaster. Why Lancaster? Lancaster, Pennsylvania, because that represented the frontier west. It's fascinating. Jews were always in the most westward frontier towns. And at that point during the Revolutionary War, Lancaster, Pennsylvania was basically, it's cool when you see where the Jewish communities were, that sort of represents the western migration of the American community in general. So Lancaster, Pennsylvania was a growing Jewish community. And you may have heard there was a vibrant Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island, which was less than 100 miles, roughly, I think, something like that. I think 60, 100 miles from where Adams grew up and lived and died in Braintree, in Newport, Rhode Island. To the best of my knowledge, my research, I don't think he ever visited the Newport congregation. George Washington famously did, but that doesn't mean anything. Washington is an exception. It has to be, we've talked about that with his famous visit to what would be called, everyone's heard of, the Touro Synagogue. Not the first synagogue in the United States. It's the oldest building that still survives. It's not the first synagogue. The first synagogue, of course, was Shearith Israel, right? Shearith Israel in New York, which still exists today. The rabbi of Shearith Israel today is Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, who actually has some amazing lectures on John Adams. If you're interested in further reading, I highly recommend it. There were no rabbis. There wouldn't be, the first rabbi wouldn't come to the United States until 1840. So who ran these congregations? The answer was Chabad. Excellent. Excellent. Who ran these synagogues? You had what was called the Chazan, right? We know the Chazan. Back then, the Chazan was kind of like the spiritual leader. It was not an ordained rabbi, but they were the people sort of, the spiritual leaders. Who were these Jews? Most of them were Sephardic. All these congregations in these 5 towns were all Sephardic congregations. They were all Spanish Portuguese. Shearith Israel today, actually, they don't. I mean, I think they do still go by the name Shearith Israel. It's called the Spanish Portuguese Synagogue in New York. These were all Sephardic communities. Although you begin to have a slow trickle of Ashkenazic Jews, mainly from Central Europe. Places like Germany, Prussia, that next wave of migration really kick up in the 1830s, 1840s, but you still have a slight trickle in these shuls, but you have all these, it's classic shul politics. They were all Sephardic congregations, and they would many of these shuls, the sermon had to be in Portuguese, even though no one understood Portuguese. They were still speaking English. By this time, they're speaking English. And you have these, the minority Ashkenazic Jews there, and they want to break away minyan. And that eventually would be what happened in all these congregations, and that's what ended up happening. Many of these Jews, many of them ended up being very wealthy. Typically, they were in the shipping, import, export business, and that was like the basic structure of the Jewish community. And again, we've had whole classes on the colonial Jewish experience, but that's kind of a snapshot of what the Jewish community that John Adams lived in. Did he have a ton of interaction? We're going to see it's minimal, and we're going to get to some of those things. Let's talk about John Adams in colonial times. Famously, John Adams, he graduates Harvard. He becomes a lawyer in Boston, and he becomes a pretty prominent lawyer and pretty well respected in Boston. Of course, it's 17. What's the year? 71 is when we have, one of the most famous broadsides in American history. That's Paul Revere's picture of the Boston. Very good. Okay, who is that kid? Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre is if you remember your American history, of course, there were the various taxes which were imposed on the colonists. Many in Boston didn't like it. Many of the redcoats, the lobsterbacks, these were the British soldiers, were sent to Boston, which was the major port in colonial America, and they were sent there to maintain law and order. And it was in I think December of 1771, something like that. Someone Google that. I'm probably off by a little bit. But it was sometime in the winter. There was a disturbance that the natives, the colonists, didn't like having the British troops around. And there was a small detachment of British troops that they were young, they were fresh, they didn't really know, and they were getting egged on by a group of rowdy colonists. We don't know exactly what happened, but there was a lot of jeering, a lot of taunting, a lot of shouting, and then a couple snowballs got thrown, and then a couple snowballs with some sticks, and then some rocks, and then someone pulled out a gun. We don't exactly know who started what, but then the bells started ringing, and basically a mob came. It's hard to know. The head of the commander of that unit, a guy named Major Preston. Does anyone remember? I think his name is Preston. It's not clear what started what and who ordered what, but the troops opened fire and killed a few people, and then I think and then a whole mob broke out, and it was pretty intense. The soldiers, including the captain, were put on trial. The crown agreed and allowed to have them put on trial, but someone needed to represent them. Remarkably, John Adams came to their defense. Now, John Adams, as we're going to see, is already brewing as a rebel and a fierce patriot and the biggest backer, certainly in Boston, of the biggest backers in Boston, of the cause of independence, which isn't quite there just yet in 71, 72, not quite there, but certainly anti-British. He wasn't quite as extreme as Samuel Adams. Who was Samuel Adams? Not the beer. But Samuel Adams was a real, he was an agitator. It was his second cousin, far more outspoken and far more loud would be his second cousin, Samuel Adams. John Adams, he admired him, but thought he was a little bit extreme. But John Adams defended successfully the troops, successfully defended them. Two soldiers actually opened fire, were branded on their thumbs. That was the punishment they did, but he saved them from the hangman's noose successfully. Why did John Adams do that? Two reasons. It's such an interesting thing. Everyone remember the story of the Meraglim, the spies, right? The Jews, right? They sent the spies into Israel. Remember that story? It's considered one of the greatest catastrophes in Jewish history. It was the story of the Meraglim. If you look, it's a fascinating thing. If you look at the verse in Deuteronomy, it says, when Moshe Rabbeinu, when Moses recounts the story, he says, I forget the exact language, he says, Ubasem kulchem, that all of you came and said, let's have spies. And Rashi points out, he says they came bi'ir buvia. What does bi'ir buvia mean? With confusion. He says everyone was pushing, was a mob. There was no order, there was no decorum. The elderly were getting pushed by the young and the women and the men and everyone. There was no order and there was no decorum. And Rashi says, isn't that interesting? It's in contradistinction to the story of Revelation at Sinai. At Har Sinai, it says, Vatikravna kulchem, that they all came orderly, that the Jews came and stood at Mount Sinai orderly. And I always found it interesting. I don't think what Rashi is telling us is that there's some random, unrelated correlation. We have the sin of the spies happen with a mob, and Matan Torah, Revelation at Sinai, was orderly and organized. I don't think Rashi is just saying, by the way, it's some weird coincidence. Rashi is either telling us one of those things caused the other. It was symptomatic. Is that when you have bad motives and things happen as a mob, that's never a good sign. Mobs are never, ever, ever, ever good, ever. Right? You want to, protest, you're not happy with something, that's okay. But when you come as a mob, that's not good. John Adams hated the fact that it was a mob. Sam Adams was excited about that. John Adams did not like the fact that it was a mob, number one. Number two, he felt, to his credit, that if we're going to be a country and we're going to, be better than the British, everyone should have a fair chance at representation. And he felt like, no, someone's got to represent these soldiers. And he did. And he felt, interestingly, he got a lot of flack for that because, again, he went against the popular sentiment of the day. But he was ultimately deeply respected for it, and ultimately would say it was one of the best things that he ever did in his life, is that he stood up for what was right, which was a fascinating thing. He would eventually, as things progressed, he would, they sent the delegates to the Continental Congress. They would meet in Philadelphia and then to the Second Continental Congress. And during the this is before declaration, this is like in 1774, 75, and early 76, before the Declaration of Independence was actually signed and authored and all of that, he said that the Continental Congress was a very disorganized, it's not like, it's still, the United States Congress today is disorganized, but that's for different reasons. He sat on more than 96 different committees. There's, according to all opinions, Benjamin Rush, who's a significant person during this time, he would say and acknowledge that Adams was the first man in the House. He was the person that ran the Continental Congress, not in terms of leadership, but he got things done. This, we're going to just fast forward a second and we'll go back. This is one of the most famous paintings in American history. This is John Trumbull's painting of the Declaration of Independence. This painting never really actually happened. This is 56 of the 41 signers of the Declaration. This picture hangs in the United States Capitol. It's a humongous picture. It took him years and years and years and years to make this picture because he had to draw 56 portraits. Okay. Now it's interesting. You'll note a couple fascinating things. So this is, Zoom friend, sorry you can't hear me. This is them handing the Declaration of Independence. We're going to see these are going to be the people on the committee who wrote the Declaration. There's John Adams. There's Thomas Jefferson. That's going to be Benjamin Franklin. So fascinating. Where is John Adams in this picture? Front and center. That's very symbolic, representing where John Adams was in the birth of the United States of America. That was not by mistake. John Adams, interestingly, when he was shown this picture, I think it was 2 weeks after Abigail died, this is late in his life, when he actually saw this painting for the first time. This is a remarkable work of art. This is one of the most significant works of art in American history. He stared at it for a long time. And it's interesting. You know what he said? He said afterwards, he said, when I nominated George Washington of Virginia for commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he took his hat and rushed out that door. That was his reaction. I want to explain what he's referring to. When the Continental Congress met, Boston was under siege from the British, and they tried, and the rebels, the Americans, they needed to put together an army. So they had to nominate someone for general of that army. And there were a couple, John Hancock, who's right here, who was the president of the Congress, Continental Congress. He was hoping to be the general in chief. But it was John Adams who was the one who said it should be George Washington, who he had just met recently in the Congress. And isn't it interesting? He would always feel that was one of the greatest things that he ever did as an American, was he was like, I was the guy that found George Washington. I was the one that nominated George Washington. And he rightfully took great pride in that to the point when he's shown this phenomenal historic picture of the Declaration of Independence, what does he think about? Not the Declaration of Independence, but the door that George Washington ran out of 2 years earlier when he, John Adams, nominated him for president, for general in chief, which was remarkable. You know, of course, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, June of 1776, the Congress decides that they're gonna draft. They hadn't yet voted that we're gonna voted for a Declaration of Independence, but they started working on it with anticipation that they would vote for independence. So there was a committee, as I mentioned, a committee of five. It ended up being a committee of five, and then a subcommittee of three: Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson, who would be the ones who would author the Declaration of Independence. And of course, it would be Jefferson who did most of the work. The famous story that Adams would write not immediately afterwards. We doubt the historical accuracy of the following statement, but it doesn't matter because it really captures so much of their personality. It could be this happened, but it probably didn't. He would write later on that Adams, who he had just met Thomas Jefferson, and he was 8 years older than Jefferson, and kind of viewed Jefferson as his protege in the Continental Congress, he would write later on that he, Adams, asked Jefferson to be the one to draft the Declaration of Independence, which is, of course, in my opinion, the greatest secular document ever written, certainly in English, no question, in my opinion. Adams explained, Jefferson demurred. He said, you're a senior, you should write it. So, of course, one of the most famous quotes of Adams, he would say, no, he insisted that you should write it. And Jefferson says, why? And Adams says, reason's enough. Jefferson, what are your reasons? Reason one, you're a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. It's just like, whether or not the story happened or not, that's how John Adams remembered it, and it like captures who he was and their relationship, which is going to be a very significant part of American history and our story. It really captures Adams and Jefferson's relationship at this time. Of course, on July 1st, the Declaration ends up getting edited and whittled down. The committee makes a couple of adjustments, and it comes to, they're not yet ready on July 1st, 1776. They're not yet ready to vote on it. And there's still a couple last holdouts, people who argue. I think it was John Dickinson. He was opposed to it. He was like, not quite yet. We shouldn't yet do this, because it was a huge step. It was treason for all of them. They all knew that if you sign a Declaration of Independence, that's treason, and everyone was well aware the punishment for treason was hanging. No question. They all knew it, so they weren't quite ready for it. And on July 1st, there was one last flag that was thrown by Dickinson, and no one really knew what to say. Jefferson would write. Jefferson did not like speaking. Jefferson was a very, very quiet person. He liked writing, but didn't like speaking. It was like one of those cold, rainy, night days. And Adams got up. You don't have the notes of what he said, but Adams got up and made a very passionate speech. Most, said this was his greatest speech of his life, where he argued why they needed to sign the Declaration of Independence, which they did. 12 out of 13 states voted for independence. Which state did not vote? New York. Still hasn't voted. As far as I know, they did not vote. But they did. They abstained. They didn't vote against. It went 12-0. Many years later, Jefferson would hail Adams as the pillar of the Declaration's support on the floor of Congress and its ablest advocate and defender against the multifarious assaults it encountered. It was during this time, the Declaration of Independence is voted upon, Mazel Tov, a country is born. We know the story, the war and all of that. While they're debating, while the Continental Congress is waiting, they start debating on, the country has to have a seal, a seal. So it's fascinating. Let me get this. You'll pardon me as I just flip through my supplementals here. Some of the seals, the suggested seals for the United States. Unless I don't have it, I apologize. Here it is. Proposals for the seal of the United States. Oh, there's our good friend Thomas Jefferson. By the way, what is that? That's you can't see it? This is the Declaration of Independence. I was just there a couple months ago. I went to see it. It's totally faded. You can't see it, but that's the Declaration. I think I spoke about it at the explanatory service. Remember I told you it's like totally faded, but that's it as of, I don't know, I think in February. So it's still there. I asked the docent, the guy there, I asked him, I said, do you mind if I make a couple of edits? And he's like, what? I'm like, I'm just cracking a joke. Just like you didn't get it. I'm like, we had just some whiteout. There's our good friend Brent Franklin. So this was Franklin's proposal for the seal of the United States. So this is a letter that John Adams wrote. He said, Dr. F, that's Dr. Franklin, proposes a device for a seal. Moses lifting up his wand and dividing the Red Sea, and Pharaoh in his chariot overwhelmed with the waters. Can you all see that? This, and with the following motto, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. So that was Franklin's proposal. He then wrote, Mr. Jefferson proposed the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and on the other side, some Saxon chiefs and whatever. I proposed the choice of Hercules as engraved by Gribelin and some editions of Lord. He had some other thing. But isn't it interesting, that you see that Jewish connection, at least that biblical connection, was present. I don't know what they decided on, but I don't think it was either of those. Adams in 1777, really for the next 10 years, he would be in France. He would be in Europe, mainly in France, but he would spend most of the next 10 years. He crossed the Atlantic to be a peace commissioner, an envoy to France. He would be an envoy to the Netherlands, eventually an envoy to Great Britain after the war. He would spend almost the entirety of the next 10 years in Europe. He was working the political work in Europe, mainly in France. He would come home for just a few months in the middle to be reassigned back to France, but he would spend most of the time there. Now, what's remarkable is crossing the Atlantic back then was a harrowing experience. I mean, you were literally, I think it would be Abigail Adams would write, Abigail Adams would say that crossing the Atlantic was like being put in jail with a chance of drowning. He crossed, his first crossing of the Atlantic was of the most harrowing experiences. They were on a boat called the Boston, and they nearly drowned in a storm, nearly died. And then, again, the way it worked back then, if you were a boat and you saw another boat, if you were at war, everything was free. It was, you just attack that boat and try to capture it as everyone would fight anyone. You saw a boat, you started fighting. So there's an amazing story. Let me just grab it over here. Let's see if I can find it. They came across a boat during this his first transit of the Atlantic, and in his diary he writes about what happened. Okay, Tuesday, March 10th, 1778. We espied a sail and gave her chase. We soon came up to her with her, but as we had borne directly down upon her, she had not seen our broadside, yada, yada, yada. They captured the ship. They captured this ship. The prize was the ship Martha, Captain Mackintosh from London. They were going to New York, loaded with a cargo of great value. Terrific. He talks about his captain on his boat. They acted very bravely. The sailors seemed to me to felicitate themselves that it was on. Okay, fine. Terrific. He says, who was on this captured boat? There were two gentlemen on board as passengers. Mr. R. Galt was one, and Mr. Wallace of New York the other. There were two young Jews on board as well. That and the next day were sent in dispatching the prize under the command of a third lieutenant, Mr. Wells, to Boston. So apparently on this boat that they captured in the high seas, there were two Jews heading to New York. What were they doing there? I don't know. But they were captured, sent back to Boston as a prize of war. That boat eventually got reconquered, and I don't know what happened to that, but it's fascinating. He would sail back to Boston, as I mentioned. Now, it was in Paris, in France. That's where he worked together as a peace commissioner with Ben Franklin. They did not get along. Ben Franklin did not like working. He liked enjoying life and partying and drinking and womanizing and doing all sorts of living. And John Adams actually was interested in working. So he respected him, but did not think very highly of Ben Franklin. As I mentioned, there was a little interlude where he was back in Boston, back in Massachusetts. It was back in Boston. It was in 1780 or something like that. He came back. People of Braintree voted for him to be a delegate to Massachusetts, like Senate or Congress, to rewrite the Massachusetts Constitution, which he did. He was the one who crafted the Massachusetts Constitution, which is still extant, and it's different ways of calculating it, but according to many, it's the oldest constitution that's still in effect out of anything that was written by John Adams. He does write about freedom of religion, sort of. He would write in Article 2, it is the right of the Massachusetts Constitution. Again, it's before the United States Constitution by 7 years. It is the right as well as the duty of all men in society, publicly and at stated season, to worship the supreme being, the great creator, the preserver of the universe. And no subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate for worshiping God in the manner and season most agreeable to the dictates of his conscience, over his religious profession or sentiments, provided he doth not disturb the public peace or obstruct others in their religious worship, which is a huge step forward and would certainly pave the way for what would ultimately be the United States Bill of Rights and the Establishment Clause. I mentioned he was sent back to France, where he became, again, a peace envoy with France to make a peace treaty with France, which he did. And France would eventually enter into the war. That was in his first go-around, they entered the war, and that they would be the ones who would win the war. He was also sent to the Netherlands to try to create a treaty with the Dutch and to get loans from the Dutch. And it was in that, and he would go there. There were many Jews in the Netherlands. And John Quincy, who was sent with John, was a little boy, he wrote in his diary the following. At about half after 4 o'clock, this is on a Friday, I remember, Papa got home, and at about 5 o'clock, we went to Mr. Leroy's, where we drank tea. And after Mr. Leroy and two other gentlemen went with us to see the Jews' synagogue and hear them sing. When we first got there, it was not begun, and therefore we went to another synagogue, which does not sing tonight. When we got back, it was almost time for them to begin. An old man with a long beard read a chapter of the Bible in Hebrew, after which 3 of them sung. They seemed to me to be songs, as I believe they were not, and they were not psalms. There was a vast congregation. The women have a place up above, but no woman could go to church without being married to the man, but the men can. Apparently, it had to be a married woman to go daven. I don't know what that's all about. But where the women are up above, what's that? The Ezras Nashim. Happens to be many churches were like that as well, but I think the Protestants, they weren't used to that. Okay, they say there are 100,000 Jews in this town. There's no way there were 100,000 Jews in that town. I am sure they are all wretched creatures, for I think I never saw in my life such a set of miserable-looking people. That's John Quincy Adams. Okay, I would steal your eye. Okay, what? Terrific. He eventually would get that commerce treaty from the Dutch, and Adams would be back in France for the Treaty of Paris after Cornwallis is captured or surrounded at Yorktown, and the good guys win. We win the Revolutionary War. Adams is in Paris, and he became now a peace negotiator with the British, and he was one of the main negotiators for the Treaty of Paris, which formally ended the Revolutionary War. That's him at the signing of the Treaty of Paris. This is John Jay. That's John Adams. Ben Franklin. I think this is a guy named Ben Craft, who was, I think that's who that is. That was one of Franklin's assistants. He was a spy for the British. And Franklin didn't care. He was like so reckless. And this was, that was Franklin's illegitimate grandson, who was his secretary. Back in France, so he would be reunited as envoys to France. So Franklin was there, and then that's when Jefferson really came, and that's when the relationship with Jefferson really was solidified. They were like best friends in France. Abigail actually joined them, and it was a remarkable thing. Not for now, the hour is late, but he was eventually then made ambassador he was the first ambassador. The ambassador, he opened up the first embassy in Netherlands. He was the first ambassador to the British, and it's actually one of the most remarkable encounters. He met George III. He was now the official recognized ambassador. He now had to meet George III. And he was very nervous about it. And he prepared to make sure he did all the pomp and ceremony. And he writes about what he did. He had to do 3 reverences. You had to walk in, you had to bow, then walk, then bow, then walk, then bow, and do all the whole thing, do it appropriately and this and that. And he was very nervous. He knew that this was setting a precedent for the next several centuries of the relationship between the United States and Great Britain. After all they went through, how's he going to be received? So he was very, very eloquent, beautifully, and spoke very impassionately about moving on. We're all friends. And King George III said, "Sir, the circumstances of this audience are so extraordinary, the language you have now held is so extremely proper, and the feelings you have discovered so justly adopted to the occasion, that I must say that I not only received with pleasure the assurances of the friendly dispositions of the United States, but that I am very glad the choice has fallen upon you to be their minister. I wish you, sir, to believe, and that it may be understood in America, that I have done nothing in the late contest, war, but what I thought myself indispensably bound to do by the duty which I owed my people. I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, as I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. The moment I see such sentiments and language as yours prevail, and a disposition to give this country a preference, that moment I shall let the circumstances of language, religion, and blood have their natural and full effect." There's a remarkable expression of let bygones be bygones, even though we would go to war 20 years later, but that would be a different story. Of course, Adams comes back to the United States. Washington is elected president. Adams is vice president. It's a portrait of him as vice president. And tomorrow is April 30th. Well, on April 30th, 1789, 226 years ago, Washington took the oath of office to become the president. Adams was there. He had taken the oath of office a few days earlier on the 21st. There was the Chazan of Sherith Israel, Gershom Mendes Seixas, was present, one of the 14 clergymen who was invited to participate in the swearing in. Adams, of course, would serve as the United States' first vice president. What are the roles of the vice president by the Constitution? He has 2 responsibilities. Number 1, if the president dies, he takes over. Number 2, he presides over the Senate. What does that mean? No one really knew. So he thought what that meant is he's the balabas of the Senate. I'm in charge of the Senate, and everything listens to me. So when the Senate first met in 1789, April, and then May and summer of 1789, he was running the show. He ran the Senate. It's remarkable. It's the funniest thing. But really in the Senate, one of the first major pieces of legislation, one of the first issues that the Senate, the United States of America, had to deal with was, what was George Washington's official title? The Constitution calls him the president, but how is he supposed to be addressed? What's the etiquette? The Congress, the House of Representatives, was like, we don't care. He's the president of the United States of America. Weiter. That's it. That's what we're calling him. But John Adams felt it was very important that we have to make it correct. And the president, he said, you could be a president of a fishing club. Like, we need something a little bit more Bakovic. We need something with a little bit more honor and regal, So they debated it for the next month, literally, fiercely, about the net. Adams was insistent that it be something. So here are a couple of his suggestions. His Excellency, His Elective Majesty, His Mightiness, His Highness, my favorite, His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of the Same. That's a mouthful. And he was ridiculed, appropriately so. Right? Well, that's a responsibility, but that's what are people supposed to refer to Washington as? So people mockingly said, well, let's give Adams a title. And as you could see in a lot of his pictures, he was a portly man. So people jokingly referred to him as his rotundity. And he was ridiculed and humiliated, and he was deeply humiliated. And he basically learned a couple of lessons. Number one, the Senate's, what did they vote on? President. President Washington, right? Mr. President, President of the United States. That's his title, and that's it. That's usually referred to. And that's what stuck, which is interesting for posterity, right? The president is no better than anyone else. He doesn't have any fancy titles. Great. But a couple of actually deeper things were learned from this lesson. Number one, what Adams learned and would really create a precedent for future generations is what the vice president isn't. He isn't really someone who's in charge of the Senate. And he really, at that point, the vice president presides over the Senate, does nothing. He doesn't really do anything. He thought he was really the architect of the Senate. That's not true. Today, the vice president, maybe if he's bored, will sit in the Senate. He is able to cast a tie if the Senate, a tiebreaker, if the Senate isn't tied. Other than that, they do nothing. They don't really preside. It's not like the Speaker of the House, who's an incredibly powerful person. Right? The vice president does not carry that power. And number two, what ended up happening, as I mentioned, Adams was ridiculed. He was ridiculed because, yes, he blundered, but more than that is Washington was like a godlike figure. George Washington was a godlike. It was not okay to criticize George Washington. So John Adams became a lightning rod for criticism of George Washington. That also stands as a precedent. Vice presidents, their job is to be a lightning rod to protect the president of the United States. Ad hayom hazeh. Toward the ends of his first term, he grew accustomed to his marginal role. He always appreciated and revered George Washington, but towards the end, his relationship with Washington cooled a little bit. He would write, "The history of our revolution will be one continued lie. The essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and outsprung General Washington. That Franklin electrified him with his rod, and henceforth these two conducted all policy negotiations and legislatures and war." He was a little embittered after 8 years of doing nothing. Of course, he was there's King George III. And of course, in 1800, in 1797, he's elected as the second president of the United States of America. He would serve one term. It was during this, in George Washington, we're going to move through this. George Washington, his famous farewell address, he really spoke against political parties. There were no political parties. George Washington ran unopposed. And he was hoping that there wouldn't be political parties. Of course, that was a fantasy, because even in his own administration, there were the seeds of different parties. Thomas Jefferson representing they would end up calling, confusingly to us, called the Democratic Republicans. Neither the Democrats or Republicans of today. They were the Democratic Republicans. Eventually, that party would fall apart as well. But they were the Democratic Republicans. They were much more pro-France. They were very anti-federalist. They did not. The other group were the Federalists. They wanted a strong federal union, a strong federal government. The Federalists were primarily led by Alexander Hamilton. Adams was there was the high Federalists, the low Federalists. Adams was sort of like a subset of the Federalist Party. And Adams and Jefferson grew farther and farther and farther apart. Jefferson, because of the way the Constitution was originally written, ended up being Adams' vice president. But they agreed on nothing. They started off as friends, but they ended up moving farther and farther and farther and farther apart. The major thing during that really came up during Adams' presidency, something that's largely forgotten by most Americans, and that's something called the quasi-war. At this point, overseas, back in France, who was the United States' greatest ally, France is now in the middle of their revolution, the French Revolution. They've declared war on Great Britain. They've declared war on anyone who's going to support Great Britain. Well, the United States was back then, and still today, was very heavily engaged in commerce. So they're constantly sending boats, to Great Britain. Would they get drawn into this war against France? That was the million-dollar question. The Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, they were Frencophiles. They loved France, and they didn't want to see war with France. The Federalists tended to side with Great Britain. And either they wanted to, many of them wanted out-and-out war against France. Adams maintained a middle ground of neutrality, and he was hyper-focused on staying out of war. He just didn't want to pick sides because he did not want to get drawn into war. If you remember one of the classic events, remember the XYZ affair? Anyone remember the XYZ affair? Basically, they had sent peace commissioners to France. The main one would be John Marshall, who would end up being the John Adams would appoint as the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, one of the most significant people in the history of the United States. But Marshall was the envoy to France. And in order to try to negotiate with France, Talleyrand and the corrupt French government basically said, you need to first write us a check, a bribe to me personally and to France, and then we'll talk about negotiations. And of course, famously, the cries went out. Robert Goodloe Harper, senator from Maryland, would say millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And they refused to pay. And it was during this time when the press really became very vocal. So you may have followed in the news recently about the Alien Sedition Acts. You've been following that in the news. This is when it was first passed, the Alien Sedition Acts. The Alien Act was basically to kick out immigrants who were rabble-rousing against the government. And the Sedition Act made it illegal to speak negatively about the government. Freedom of speech. It's hard to understand how this thing made its way through, but people actually were jailed. Adams signed them into law begrudgingly. He wasn't really interested in it, but he didn't want to veto it, and he was in enough of a political corner. He signed it, and he did whatever he could not to enforce it. Adams would lose the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson and was embittered. On reflecting on his presidency, Adams would always feel that making sure the United States stayed out of war was his greatest accomplishment. Because had they gone into war, they would have been destroyed. They were not strong enough to fight their own wars. Amazing Rashi. Rashi tells us, remember the Jews are wandering in the desert. And they go from this place to this place, and they were wandering. Right? There's a parsha called Maseh, where the Torah lists out the 48 travels that the Jews went in the desert. And Rashi says, why does the Torah list names and places? Why does the Torah do this? And Rashi says, if you put it all together, you will note that for 38 of those 40 years, the Jews were only in 20 different places. And he says that teaches us the chesed, the kindness of God. Think about it. 20 places in 38 years isn't horrible. It could have been so much worse. Can you imagine living out of a tent for 40 years, constantly a nomad, packing up, living out of a suitcase, right? You have no stability. It could have been so much worse. And the Torah highlights, you should know this is a sign of God's love to the Jewish people, that it could have been so much worse. Psychologists call this the feature positive effect. I'll give you, this was one of my favorite stories. Nothing to do with this, but just as a great illustration. It was during World War II, the B-17 bomber, which saved the day. Sometime in the middle of now you can only have so much weight on the B-17 bomber. Like every ounce on that thing is accounted for, because every another pound of armor is a pound of munitions that it can't carry. They decided somewhere through its lifespan that they needed to reinforce it with a little bit more armor. So they did a big study of all these B-17s. Where were the bullet holes on the B-17? And they noticed the B-17, it had many, many more bullet holes in the tail than it had on the wing. So the people who were reviewing it said, you know what? We should reinforce which section? Tail. That's where all the bullet holes are. And there was a young Jewish kid. He said, "Pum fakert," which is Italian for the exact opposite. The exact opposite. Because where are all the planes with the bullet holes on the wings? They're in the bottom of the sea. It's the feature positive. And we tend to overly emphasize things that feature positively in our lives. So we look at the great heroes of American history, George Washington for what he accomplished, Lincoln for what he accomplished. And we don't give enough emphasis and credence for what didn't happen, that could have happened and could have been disastrous. you don't celebrate the fact that we didn't go to war. It's not something that you remember historically. In a certain sense, that may be just as significant as winning World War I, as winning World War II, is the fact that we never got into a war with France, which we would have lost and would have been the end of the country. Adams was deeply satisfied and felt like he'd done a big mitzvah, which he did. The election of 1800, he loses to Thomas Jefferson. He doesn't stay for his inauguration. People have historically turned that into a scandal. It probably wasn't, because there really wasn't any precedent about it, about like, do you stay for the incoming president's inauguration? But the truth of the matter is their relationship was deeply strained, and they basically wouldn't talk to one another for another 20 years. In his retirement, this is where Adams' correspondences are just amazing. One of the most significant correspondences is with one of the most fascinating people in American Jewish history, Mordechai Emanuel Noah. Mordechai Emanuel Noah, he traveled the world. He has a whole story about him, but he sent some of his writings to Adams. And Adams wrote two fascinating letters to Mordechai Emanuel Noah. I'm going to read them. They're not here. Hold on one second. Let me just pull them up. Okay, I'm just going to skip through. Okay, Adams to Mordechai Emanuel Noah. This is July of 1818. He talks about the fact that Noah is Jewish, and he says, I have had occasion to be acquainted with several gentlemen of your nation and to transact business with some of them. My accountant was Jewish, right? Who I found to be men of liberal minds, as much honor, probity, generosity, and good breeding as any I have known in any sect of religion or philosophy. I wish your nation be admitted to all the privileges and citizens in every country of the world. This country has done much. I wish it may do more, and annul every narrow idea in religion, government, and commerce. Let the wits of yoke, the philosophers sneer. What then? It has pleased the providence of the first cause, the universal cause, that Abraham shall give religion not only to Hebrews, but to Christians and Mohammedans, the greatest part of the modern civilized world. I am, sir, though a stranger, with much esteem, your humble and obliged servant, John Adams. Pretty cool, right? Listen to this, one of the most remarkable letters ever written. This is in 1819. Okay, when is Herzl living? 80 years later. Listen to what Adams writes to Noah later. I really wish the Jews again in Judea, an independent nation. For as I believe the most enlightened men of it have participated in the ameliorations of the philosophy of the age. Once restored to an independent government and no longer persecuted, they would soon. Now he says, wouldn't that be amazing? Go back to Eretz Yisrael, sing Hatikva. John Adams, a proto-Zionist, right? He really is. But what's going to happen once the Jews have independence? We're not going to be prosecuted anymore. Great, things will calm down. But then he says, well, once that happens, they would soon wear away some of the asperities and peculiarities of their character, possibly in time become liberal Unitarian Christians. For your God is our God, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob is our God. So like he davens, he says, right? May be pleased return. The Jews should go back to Israel. Won't that be great? And once you're there, you'll recognize that Jesus is Lord and Savior, right? But it's a remarkable letter. It's an astonishing letter that he has that awareness. I want to end the hours later. I just want to end with just two more last thoughts. There's an amazing story. Remember the story of Korach? Korach leads a rebellion against the Jewish people. And his two henchmen are Dasan and Aviram. Dasan and Aviram are of the greatest villains in the history of the Jewish people. They accuse Moshe of nepotism. They call Moshe all sorts of improper names. They accuse him of the most egregious of things. They're villains of the highest order. The verse says that Moshe, they end up leading the rebellion of Korach. We all know the end of the story of Korach. They're punished by God. God has the earth opens up and swallows them. They die. They're consumed by the ground. They're villains. Before that happens, Moshe calls for Dasan and Aviram. He wants to befriend them. And the Talmud says, you see from here, a person should always try to minimize machlokas, disagreement. And Moshe tries to calm them down, speak to them, and try to work out some kind of accommodation. The Gemara even says, anyone who's machzik b'machlokas. Why did Moshe do that? The Gemara says, because anyone who's machzik b'machlokas, anyone who holds on to disagreement, anyone who encourages disagreement, violates a law in the Torah. Lo yek korach b'chataso. Thou shalt not be like Korach, who leads a rebellion. So why does Moshe call for Dasan and Aviram? So I think there are two reasons. First of all, he wants to not have a disagreement because he doesn't want to violate this prohibition. He wants to do what the Torah says. Okay, no disagreements. But I think there's a deeper reason. Moshe felt that despite the fact that Dasan and Aviram are such scoundrels and such bad people, he was hoping to sit down and talk. Maybe they can mend their relationship. Maybe they can figure out a way to solve their problem. It didn't end up working, but Moshe tried. And that's an amazing lesson. As a rabbi, I tragically see so many people who have estrangements in relationships. A sibling, God forbid, a kid, a parent. It's so common. We get into fights, and it's okay to have disagreements, and that's normal, human, and natural. But too often, painfully so, we get into disagreements and we burn our bridges, and what would otherwise be loving, cherished relationships, I cut people out of my life. And that's a tragedy. And we need to have the courage and the strength and the guts to let bygones be bygones, and let's figure this out. And let's not stand on and go to the grave, never speak again. It's tragic. And let's learn the lesson from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe, he's in a fight with Dasan and Aviram. He was right, they were wrong. He doesn't stand on ceremony. Fine, okay. He still tries to get past it. And it seems it could have and should have worked. It didn't, but at least he tried. Benjamin Rush, we talked about earlier, he had seen that it was tragic. Adams and Jefferson, it's now post-presidency, they're both retired. Jefferson is down in Monticello in Virginia. Adams is up still in Braintree in Massachusetts. They haven't spoken to each other in 20 years. And Chaval al Avdan, says Rush, isn't that so sad? These guys used to be best of friends. Yes, they got into a fight. They see the world differently. But, and he wrote, to Benjamin Rush's credit, he wrote to both of them. And he said, it's time to bury the hatchet. You guys need to be kiss and make up. And they did. And thus began the greatest literary correspondence the English language has ever seen, without question. The greatest literary correspondence in English were the letters that went back and forth between Adams and Jefferson. I think it's something like 180 letters back and forth. If you read them, first of all, you will realize these men were brilliant, the most well-read people. You can't understand half of what they're saying because they're quoting Thucydides and Cato, and in the original, they're throwing Greek and Latin. They're brilliant. But the moral of the story, isn't that beautiful? Right? They got into a fight. I mean, it was too long that they were in that fight, but they were able to move on. And they rebuilt a loving relationship. In those letters, we got to read it because we have to, because it's too amazing. I'm sorry, the hour's a little late, but I apologize. In one of the letters in 1813, Jefferson writes to Adams, they start talking about the Jews and the Torah. And I have to read this, it's just remarkable. Jefferson says, to compare the morals of the Old with those of the New Testament, he's comparing the Old Testament to the New Testament, would require an attentive study of the former and a search through all its books for its precepts, and through all its histories for its practices, and the principles they prove. As commentaries too on these, the philosophy of the Hebrews must be inquired into. Their Mishnah, their Gemara, Kabbalah, Jazira, I think that's the Sefer Yetzirah, Zohar, this is Jefferson writing, Kosri, I don't know what that is, and their Talmud must be examined and understood in order to do them full justice. Brucker, who's some, author, it should seem, has gone deeply into these repositories of their ethics, and Ainfield, his epistemizer, concludes in these words, and he quotes someone. This is Jefferson's Taich. This is Jefferson's opinion of what the Torah, of what the Judaism is all about. Ethics were so little studied among the Jews that in their whole compilation called the Talmud, there is only one treatise on moral subjects. What's he referring to? Pirkei Avos. There's only one, right? Now, of course, that's moronic because anyone's ever studied the Torah. Yes, there's only one volume solely dedicated to ethics, but the whole Talmud is everywhere there's ethics, but whatever. That's what they had read. Their book of morals chiefly consisted in a minute enumeration of duties. From the law of Moses were deduced 613 precepts, which were divided into two classes, affirmative and negative, 248 in the former and 365 in the latter. That is correct. It may serve to give the reader some idea of the low state of moral philosophy among the Jews in the Middle Ages, to add that of the 248 affirmative precepts, only 3 were considered as obligatory upon women. That's incorrect. I don't know what he's talking about. And that in order to obtain salvation, it was judged sufficient to fulfill any one single law in the hour of death. He's referring to like an obscure passage in the Talmud that yesh mi shekano olamo b'sha'achas, which means it is possible for a person to repent right before you die and you'll make it into heaven. Now, we don't believe it's black. That's a Christian notion. Oh, so perfect. You're in heaven as opposed to hell. It's, of course, there's responsibility and accountability for your actions. But he found one passage in the Talmud, distorts it, takes it out of context, and Paskins, he rules that Judaism is stupid. The observance of the rest being deemed necessary only to increase the facility of the future life. What a wretched depravity and sentiment and manners must have prevailed before such a corrupt maxims could have obtained credit. It is impossible to collect from these writings a consistent series of moral ethics. And now Jefferson concludes, it was the reformation of this wretched depravity of morals which Jesus undertook. Mazel tov. Now, Adams replied to that by going through, it's like a wild, it's like pages where he goes through the 10 commandments that we have. Are they actually correct? What happened to the aluchos? It's like wild stuff. It's wild. But then, I don't have it. Where is it? Okay, here it is. I'm sorry. It's like a super long letter, but then in the end he writes, but you must be weary as I am at present, of problems, conjectures, and paradoxes concerning Hebrew, Grecian, and Christian, and all other antiquities. But while we believe that the finis bonurum, I don't know what that is, some Latin, they drop these Latin, I don't know what they mean. We'll be happy. We may leave learned men in this disquisitions and criticism. I admire your employment in selecting the philosophy and divinity of Jesus and separating it from all intermixtures. If I had eyes and nerves, I would go through both testaments and mark all that I understand. Now he says like this, to examine the Mishnah Gemara, Kabbalah, Jazira, Zohar, Kosri, and Talmud of the Hebrews would require the life of Methuselah, all right? And after all his 969 years would be wasted very little prayer, right? It would take you a long time to go through Kol Torah Kula. Then he talks about how the Jews have been persecuted and the Talmud was burnt in France in 1263 and this and that. He basically tells Jefferson, go study, right? Gemara, Rashi, Tosas, Poskim, and Rishonim and Achronim. Go through the entire all of Judaism and then criticize them. Like it's not fair to criticize them, without really studying. It's a remarkable letter, and his self-awareness of not criticizing without knowing is remarkable. Now, someone alluded, and we'll wrap up with this. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of course, July 4th, 1826. Beginning of July in 1826, both Adams and Jefferson's health begin to really fade, really, really fade. They both wanted to live to be able to see the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And that's just what they were yearning for. But they were both very, 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 critically ill. Adams would die on July 4th. Of that year, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. His final words were, Jefferson lives. Those were his final words. Now, he was wrong, because in what must be an act of total divine providence, Thomas Jefferson had just died a few hours earlier, also on July 4th. Only two presidents to die on July 4th, within hours of one another. Best of friends, enemies, best of friends again. The two people who are probably most responsible for this country die on the same day. But in a certain sense, and I strongly encourage, read some of Rabbi Soloveitchik's works on Adams and Jefferson, point he makes, which I think I want to echo. You know, when you talk about Adams and John Adams and the Jews, and yeah, there wasn't a robust Jewish community back then. He had some fascinating interactions. Probably and possibly John Adams' greatest connection with the Jewish community are you and me today. We talk about being Jewish. We talk about having hakaras hatov, having gratitude to people who came before us and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to God. Adams and Jefferson personify the Declaration of Independence. Adams and Jefferson personify the creation of this country. You delete Adams, you delete Jefferson from the history of the United States of America, you and I are not standing here today. That's a reality. We owe a tremendous debt of hakaras hatov to them, and significantly more importantly, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God, to sending these people as agents, as shluchim of God, to create a country so that we actually have freedoms. I always encourage everyone to recognize we are at a historically, we're the 0.01%. Jews never had the opportunities and freedoms that we have today. And we take it for granted because we didn't see what life was like in France in 1263 when the Talmud was burnt. We didn't see those experiences. And we take it for granted. And we need to fight that. We need to have the hakaras hatov, the appreciation to these great men, but more importantly to God for setting up a country that we can live in general peace and prosperity. In a certain sense, Jefferson does. Adams was right. Thomas Jefferson lives. Maybe not physically, but his message of the Declaration of Independence, which Adams certainly had a huge role to play in. The message, the freedoms that we enjoy, they do still live on. And I think each and every one of us, we owe a debt of gratitude to Adams, and more importantly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for having sent a guy like Adams with all of his imperfections and with all of his flaws and all of his many peculiarities. But the reality is that he was an agent of freedom for all of us. I want to thank you all for coming. Hope to see you next time. Everyone is dismissed. The test will be tomorrow. And if anyone has any questions, I know I didn't take questions, but if anyone have questions, feel free to field whatever questions you got.